Welcome to Belmont Author Spotlight. I'm your host, Anne Marie Mahoney, and I'm very excited today to have with me Doug Hall, who has written this book about his grandfather, Legacy of the Skies, a grandson's tribute to a legendary aviator. This is really a masterful work. In fact, we had to be interrupted from our chat with each other, exchanging information. The book is so good. And I am going to launch right into Doug, how he started this research, who this grandfather was, and all of the amazing history that this man participated in firsthand. Doug, welcome.
Well, thank you. I'm thrilled to be here.
Tell us about your grandfather, because as you say in the very beginning, you never met him.
Yes, part of the joy of the result of the book is to have been the one that did the research to dig his story out. So he was not someone that was a part of our lives because he would die before I was born, certainly, and then my father would be separated from his father, my grandfather, at a very young age. So the storyline, in a sense, begins with the fortune of having a trail to follow. So he, my grandfather, in fact, was well known enough in terms of newspapers and military accounts and other publications so that I could actually begin to find a trail to start my research and, as you pointed out, to learn about somebody who I really knew almost nothing about.
Okay. Yeah. So you're drawing on a number of resources, and as you said, public information, newspapers or whatever. You actually, and you're very clear about this in the book for the reader, you actually found yourself reconstructing situations and conditions from the other sources that more than likely applied to your grandfather or certainly gave you some background.
Right. So what I found was that when I was able to find either a database online that was a library database or a military database or a newspaper database, that there was a process of finding a hit, I guess, a headline, a story, an article, something that was deeper than just a few sentences. It really covered an activity or a period of his life. And as soon as I found that, then I would start to cross-reference that and search other databases and try to sew together a story. In one part of his life where he is with the beginning financing, capitalization, and development of airmail. Now, there was no book that referred to his involvement. However, if I did the detailed search on a newspaper or several newspaper locations, and all of a sudden he's showing up in articles relating to the first test runs of the airmail plane. How is the airmail plane useful and valuable related to the business notes and stocks and bonds and treasury notes that it carries? He's involved in this small group of people, and by virtue of the research within several different databases, I'm kind of stitching together a story till it begins to make more sense and begins to be kind of more chronological.
Yeah. And as you trace his story, in many ways, what you're telling the reader is a story of the development of aviation, and especially wartime use of aviation, both through the First and Second World Wars.
Yes. So by virtue of his, I guess, timing of his life, becoming a cadet, being trained for flight for World War I, he is going to step into the first real use of the airplane, which unfortunately is war, but nonetheless, that was the circumstance. He will be trained ground certified in Princeton University, and then he'll go through flight training school very briefly in a very famous airfield in Mineola, Long Island. And then very quickly will be in the air and seeing action as a bomber squadron pilot, and jumping out of that world at the end of World War I, and these are very compressed periods of time, he will then land in the period of time where airmail service is being developed, and the government has decided that there is a use for this. And then there's the financiers, the capitalists have to develop the money to raise to develop and design the airplane. The first great airplane designers, Martin and Curtis
de Havilland.
De Havilland and others are starting to design the plane, and then in turn, former pilots, such as my grandfather, is actually going out to the airfields to observe the test runs of the airplanes and how they're landing, how they're maneuvering, and using kind of a first-hand knowledge from being up in the air during World War I, and since being a part of this team and giving feedback as to what he's seeing that might need to be developed further, et cetera. So he's jumping on board in the airmail industry as it is born. Jumping there, he will, to skip a couple of steps aside from landing in Wall Street for a period of time, which is directly related to his financial success, teaming with some of these financiers and capitalists in the airmail service. He will find himself in the route-to-route competition, which is going to develop the first commercial demand for airlines. Howard Hughes will develop TWA, Eastern, Pan American will be developed. First, what had to happen was pilots had to show best times from point A to point B. So my grandfather would be competing with another pilot, be it James Jimmy Doolittle or Captain Frank Hawks, to come up with the best route time from Chicago to New York City or Washington, D.C. to New York City, all those routes. So that will become competition and also interrelationships with the development of early commercial airlines. After that time, he'll be drawn into World War II again as a pilot and also an advisor, and his life will change again to being totally committed towards a world war in Europe, in which he'll be tasked with developing squadrons for photo reconnaissance. And then he will lead photo reconnaissance and the development of photo reconnaissance while in Europe, as his 13th and 7th Squadron will be what referred to as the eyes of the 8th. They will take the photos of the targets in Nazi-occupied Germany. So and then later, when he becomes lieutenant colonel and then colonel, he will be tasked with mapping the coast of Normandy for the D-Day invasion. So in a sense, you're starting with a young man. There's a photograph of him at 22 years old as a cadet standing and smiling. Little did he know what was ahead of him. And you're at the arc of World War I, all the way over past all these uses of aviation, and his largest role finishing as a colonel directing the photo reconnaissance for World War II.
World War II.
Yeah.
An amazing story. And,
Yeah.
and in the middle of that, so it isn't just somebody who's drafted, taught how to fly an airplane, jumps in the cockpit, I'm over France, World War I, whatever, war's over, I'm on to the rest of my life. This was an individual who was so intimately involved, really, in the development of aviation, as you say, but again, not just the flying, but the mechanics of it.
Right.
The construction of these planes, working with the people we just mentioned, Curtis and de Havilland, Glenn Martin,
Right.
on what are these planes going to look like, what are their function, what do they need to be able to do.
Right.
And he was testing in the long-distance runs, the races.
That's right. Yeah.
I found the races, but also back to the mail delivery. You don't even think about that. You think about Pony Express as the big shift
Right.
in how we get mail from one part of
True.
the country to the other.
Right.
But this was dramatic. We forget that,
Yeah.
that mail was being carried on trains or whatever. All of a sudden, wait a minute, we can get
Right.
mail from New York, as you say, to Chicago or someplace in a matter of hours.
Right.
And how the banking industry and the stock exchange latched onto that.
Right. Yeah, and that was the connection that I made, and that's part of the kind of the joy of researching a subject, and in particular if it's personal, you learn something. So my connection was, how do I connect chapter about airmail development, and then my grandfather leaves that industry? Why
Right.
would you
I'm
leave?
outta
Why
here.
would you
Right.
leave that industry and go to Wall Street?
Yes.
And then I'm digging in articles, and the articles from Postmaster General, other people involved with understanding the demand, they're explaining, well, the mail is not postcards, not travel postcards.
No.
Okay, that's your vision
It's
of it
not letters to your
currently.
sweet aunt. No.
The 80 to 90% of the mail is business mail. That's why there's a demand, business mail, and primarily stocks, bonds, treasury notes, documentation, et cetera. And that relates to Wall Street. And the turnover time is the difference in cost of interest rates. If you
Yes.
get the non-negotiable note from point A to point B in 4 days instead of 10 to 12 days, you've saved an enormous amount of money. And the real-time turnaround was very valuable and real to the Wall Street market and the brokerage. So he lands there with all this knowledge of finance and capitalism and takes off into that world. So yes, there's all these different angles that come sort of intersect, and he happens to be in some of these extraordinary time periods. Yeah.
Yes. Well, with the crash in
And the crash,
1929,
right.
and yet he came out of that and
Yeah.
survived and moved on.
Right. I can't explain that. I wish I had more of a trail to understand how that happened, but he certainly did move on, and
And we should say that he was a broker.
He was a
bought
broker.
into the stock exchange. He had a
Yes.
seat on the stock exchange, which was huge in those days.
it was. He was mentored by a well-known brokerage during the time, and then he bought a seat on the New York Stock Exchange for an unheard of amount of money during that time, $595,000 in 1920s money. And then he opened his own brokerage, and he was within that world for only maybe 3 years, and then the stock market would crash. But he would then all of a sudden find another direction. He would be off and running in the direction of competing for commercial flight routes, or I should say pre-commercial flight routes. And he got the nickname of the flying broker. So a lot of action is occurring at the same time, though I break it out into chapters. Really, he's involved in Wall Street and activities there. He's already starting to fly pre-commercial routes. He's getting nicknamed in the newspapers. The flying broker is at it again with all the sort of yellow journalism and great sort of catchphrases, and headlines are being thrown around. And you have pictures of him with his flight hat on and the goggles, and all his competitors, and they're talking about chasing each other, running each other, beating each other. All these phrases are jumping around. So he's able to jump from one circumstance to the other, but yet there is still a lot of other crossover of activity going on in his life. One other aspect would be political. Literally during the same time period or a little bit later, he's going to be drawn into the anti-prohibition movement.
Right.
Where does that come from? Well, I guess charisma, personality, and the fact that he's an expert pilot. So the largest organization is called the Crusaders. They have begun to try politically to promote the repeal of prohibition. And so he will fly a plane that has an enormous decal on it that says repeal prohibition. And he'll make flights, he'll join rallies, he'll probably speak in front of crowds, et cetera. So these will be another aspect. So these adventures are going on almost coincidentally until World War II starts, and then that's a total focus and commitment.
And you have some wonderful photos in the book of the plane with the
Yes.
decal, with him meeting, I think, Calvin Coolidge.
He meets Hoover,
Hoover, I'm sorry.
who they determine they want to at least have a chance to speak with him, but he's not receptive to any
No, any
idea of
political
repeal.
overtones,
But,
right, but
yeah, so
no,
the
it's
photos were wonderful. And again, I have to thank the circumstance of overturning every leaf. If anybody is going down this road of research regarding a family member, search wide. Don't be afraid to pick up the phone or write a letter or talk to somebody who you may not really even know, but they're a relative of yours. My first cousin, who I had hardly known, would be the gold mine for me. She lives in Texas, and she's the daughter, the granddaughter of my grandfather's marriage to Ann Burnett, who had a ranching empire in Texas. And I just wrote an introductory letter saying, I know we've barely met each other, but I'm writing a book on our grandfather. And then I get back a text that says, you're welcome to the collection I have, and you've hit the jackpot. Yeah. And then she shows me images, and I'm knocked out.
Fantastic photographs.
So that really helped, and I really have to thank her for being so generous.
That's good.
Yeah.
Before we morph into World War II, I just want to continue to follow up in the 1930s. And again, the development of flight, and you're seeing him in the thick of other names that we recognize, like Lindbergh and Doolittle and Frank Hawks. And these, as you said, the races and the timing, and expanding the ability to fly not just from New York to California, but into Canada, down to Mexico, Cuba. Just expand. Like always pushing the envelope.
Yeah.
However, all of that, as exciting as it is, as you read it in the book, also brought tragedy. And that, as with any sort of adventure like this, or progress in development of science or whatever, you have tragedies and crashes and deaths. And
absolutely. And he escaped several circumstances. As all the pilots knew, a lot of their challenges to time and speed were against known obstacles.
Right.
But they were of that character. So his close calls were dramatic. And I guess in relation to the other pilots around him, were part and parcel to the reality of the adventurous and dangerous flight experiments that they were on, really running dry routes. I mean, he would have two circumstances, one of which is more, I think, showing a certain level of just young immaturity and desire to fly off somewhere and have an adventure. He's working for the brokerage that I mentioned earlier, and he and another pal who's also working for a brokerage decide that they're going to lift off with his seaplane from the East River in New York City, and they're going to fly into the middle of Quebec, and they're going to find this gold mine that his broker might find worthy of purchasing or worthy of taking advantage of, because gold is still very valuable. And then they will disappear. And in those days, disappear means a longer period of time than it does currently, because we could simply text, but there's no text during that time.
New.
So he was determined as missing and lost by the Canadian powers that be, and there were flights looking for him, et cetera. And it turned out that he had engine trouble, which is not surprising, in a rainstorm, and they landed in the middle of nowhere in Quebec. And he had actually had the time, at least before, this is the return flight, he had gone to the mine, and he'd scoped out the mine and tried to evaluate its use for gold. So they together will be stranded in the middle of nowhere in Quebec, and they're going to decide to self-rescue, because they're not going to expect anybody's going to find them. So they climb to the top of a hill, and they look out in several directions, and they do see a ranger station, so they will spend the next 48 hours going through brush, through the middle of nowhere, following their compass and their best sense of direction. They'll find their way to this ranger station and, in a sense, be saved, because there is a ranger, in fact, at the station. Good. And he will help his way back. So in the book, I say that's like being plucked from fate, because no one's going to find you.
No.
So, and you're not going to get your plane started again without a mechanic. So, but yeah, and I think that maybe that became kind of the standard by which you shared stories with other pilots. Unfortunately, a more tragic circumstance would be the loss of life. So he is actually at his Crusader point in time where he's flying a lot of people to different meetings. And he's going to fly one individual who's well known within unions and political organizations. And they'll be in Staten Island. And once again, the plane is still an unpredictable piece of machinery. He'll lift off, and then within about 200 to 300 feet, then the plane is going to shake so violently that he instinctually, as a pilot, knows that the plane is going to come apart. And he turns to his passenger and says, "Jump out." And they both have parachutes. My grandfather leaps out. The Union leader leaps out. Unfortunately, the Union leader does not survive. The plane goes down and crashes into a suburban home, setting the home on fire. And my grandfather will walk away with just barely a scratch. So he certainly was of that caliber of being able to put some of these experiences behind him, as I guess you had to, because there's many other stories. Certainly Charles Lindbergh, they said, had 7 lives. Lindbergh came close to the end many, many times after the most famous flight in history when he crossed the Atlantic. He would go on to test planes, help design planes, and be in near misses and survive crashes and crash landings throughout his career.
Yep.
So it was part of the...
Amazing, amazing.
Yeah.
Now, again, just before he gets into World War II, he takes another turn off the beaten path to Texas,
Right.
to the marriage to Amranette, and raising and racing quarter horses.
Right. So he did have a love and a passion for horses and had raced horses or had riders race horses for him during that time when it was becoming very popular, really in the late 20s and early 30s. So he will meet and fall in love with his wife, Anne Burnett, and she would be the heir to an enormous ranch in Texas, and her passion was horsemanship. And so she would team with him. I really think of their relationship as a partnership, and decide that she loved the American quarter horse and found out that through interbreeding the line was getting diluted, and that you would lose the true breed of the American quarter horse over time. So they both decided that it was a raceable horse, and that the powers that be around them, being other ranch owners that had horses that were interested in racing horses, they came together as a group and organized to promote the American quarter horse to be accepted as a racing horse breed. And so that was a total commitment and focus of his, along with his wife Burnett at the time. He was the natural marketer, he was the natural promoter, he was the natural organizer. That was his piece of it. She was more, in a sense, on a technical side, understanding bloodlines. What is the process by which we keep this horse as breed proper as we can, and preserve it? And so between the two of them, they did get the credentialing, and I don't pretend to know the actual credentialing body, but they got the credentialing that identified the American quarter horse as a racing breed.
Yeah. Again,
And that was another chapter.
Right,
Yeah.
right, and another chapter that changes history of some little piece of our culture.
Right, yeah.
All right, then we do get to World War II, and he does sort of like so many other people at that time, including, we were talking earlier, my dad,
Right.
answered the call.
Yes.
And realized that he already had so much experience, both flying and understanding airplanes, but in particular, the photographic reconnaissance. So
Yes.
talk a little bit about what he did for World War II, which was so critical.
So going all the way back to World War I very briefly, they were at first testing the very basic nature of photo reconnaissance in World War I. It wasn't terribly effective. You would literally have a massive camera that's mounted on the side of the fuselage, and you're taking some photos. So he's going to step into a role where the upper the upper staff of the military in the U.S. is going to already recognize that photo reconnaissance has to be developed, that it's going to be critical.
Right.
We don't have the technology that we want right now, but we know the concept, and we know that in World War II that this is really going to be critical. So he's tasked with, on a pretty short timetable, with training a young squadron of men, as they all were young, 19, 20, 21, 22 years old, and to train them in Colorado Springs, both how to fly properly, how to understand the use of photo reconnaissance cameras in flight, and also how to recognize the different, patterns and aspects of landscape. And come together. I mean, he had to develop his own training program with other officers, so that's what they did. And that would then lead, in a very compressed period of time, to them already moving to New Jersey for the great troop transport ships that took you across to England. And before you knew it, these very young men in their early 20s were already in England, and they were already getting prepared to fly over Nazi-occupied Europe and to start taking photographs. And his squadron, the 13th and later the 7th, was embedded under the mighty 8th, the 8th Air Force, which was the bombing division that went across from England to Nazi-occupied Europe on these incredible bombing runs with a very high casualty rate, somewhere around 40%. So his life focus in that role, I think, was to further the development of photo reconnaissance, to make it more of a certain art of technology. And he did, I think, with the changes and problems and issues they had along the way. He would find himself in a promotional role that basically would tell the public and the press his side of the story. With the 8th, of course, the pilots and the bombers, and rightly so, are getting the publicity. They are risking their lives, but the photo reconnaissance pilots are also risking their lives and getting shot down.
Equally so.
So he, at every moment, is going to be telling his story to the press, to the newspapers as much as he can, and promoting and showing in pictures in the book, where he literally has the photo reconnaissance shot of the harbor in France, and with his pencil saying, this is what we do. This is a rubber plant here. This is a military troop deployment down here, and over here we have 2 or 3 ships in the harbor. So I think he tells the story as well as develops the technology. And ultimately, his greatest task will be when he is promoted to colonel, when the upper level of the military decide that they're going to invade Normandy, France. And they will task him with mapping the coastline of Normandy, so they have literally a photographic map before D-Day.
Of the entire coastline, and then in.
And then in.
Because once they land, where are they going?
Right.
And so an enormous amount of photographic mapping and evidence. This is what we're going to encounter. This is where we're going, which was completely critical to the success of the D-Day invasion.
Right. When they realized the different successes that they had, it was just a matter really of how quickly can the photograph get developed, printed, and interpreted.
Yes.
And then targeted, and then off goes the 8th, and then later the 9th, who would serve from almost D-Day forward till the fall of Berlin.
Right.
So that's that I feel probably he would reflect on if I could ask him, which I can't, but I would say the reflection of his contribution and his involvement, and probably the overall challenge, greatest challenge of his life would be then.
would be that.
would be World
exactly.
War II, I really
Yes.
feel. I mean, the
Yes.
others are, in their way, challenging. Some of them are more or less, I'm funding this adventure or this entrepreneurship, and I'm going to pursue it as far as I can take it.
Right.
And sometimes it's like, well, that might only be 3 years. Oh, fine, let it be 3.
Yeah.
And then I'll move on to something else. So this, the World War II aspect, the final, which I dedicate 2 full chapters, I think really most challenging, most satisfying part of his life, I would say.
And so he completes his military career in Washington, D.C. as a colonel and as chief of reconnaissance of Army Air Forces, because people have to remember there was no Air Force as a separate
Right, right.
military branch. It was under the auspices of the Army.
That's
And
right.
So that's what he did.
Right.
So amazing, amazing career. Let me ask you one final question.
Sure.
We've talked so much. This has been so interesting. What would, having done all of the research in the book and all of it, what would you want your children and grandchildren to remember about your grandfather?
I guess I would like them to, first of all, be certain to learn about him. And one of the reasons for writing the book, thus, is that other generations, children, as you say, can read and be aware of it. But I guess for me, if I'm to tell them not a lesson, but what he represents to me, here's a man that on the front of it, you would say, okay, very exciting, incredible, adventurous life. But at the same time, no, this was not all that wonderful a time in life. We're talking about World War I. We're talking about the crash of the stock market, which turned the world into a depression. We're talking about moving on into another war. But to be those children that follow in our family, but to be passionate about something, to pursue something, and have the good fortune of being passionate about your life, and results can happen.
Right.
So.
Well, thank you so much for being our guest today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you for the book. I encourage everyone to go out and get Legacy of the Skies. Very well written, researched, and just fascinating little information that you are going to stumble on as you read it and put it all together. Thank you very much, Doug Hall. I'm Anne Marie Mahoney for Belmont Author Spotlight. See you in the next time.